Welcome to the Financial Orientation Session for School Board Trustees. My name is Gabriel Sakali, and I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Financial Policy and Business Division of the Ministry of Education. The purpose of this presentation is to provide you as trustees with some of the basic financial information for you to discharge your fiduciary responsibilities. The role of a school board trustee is an important one in ensuring that all of Ontario's children are ready to meet the challenges of an ever-changing world. Before we start going into detail on the financial front, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the overall context in which we are operating. In April 2014, the government, after province-wide consultations with various stakeholders, including trustees, published its new vision for education in Ontario. That document, entitled Achieving Excellence, a Renewed Vision for Education in Ontario, lays out the 4 goals for a strong, publicly funded education system in Ontario. These goals are achieving excellence, ensuring equity, promoting well-being, and enhancing public confidence. This vision for education is reflected in all of our priorities and in all we do. If you have not had a chance to read the vision yet, I would urge you to do so. You can find it on the Ministry of Education website. I'm sure you all know that in Ontario we have 4 publicly funded school systems: English Public, English Catholic, French Public, and French Catholic. There are 72 school boards across Ontario with almost 2 million students and over 210,000 teachers and education workers. There are over 4,900 schools in the province with an asset value of over $52 billion. Funding in 2014-15 is about $22.5 billion. It's a very big and complex system. Financial planning is a vital and integral part of trustees' overall responsibilities to ensure the effective stewardship of the board's limited resources. Trustees need to ensure that the budget developed and approved lives within the funding provided and that the approved budget is balanced. Trustees also need to ensure that the budget reflects the board's strategic plan and vision. Without that strong link between your strategic plan and your budget, you will not be able to achieve your goals as an organization. Successful organizations are ones that ensure this strong linkage. I will now get into the substance of the presentation. Today we will cover how funding is allocated to the 72 school boards across Ontario through a formula called the Grants for Student Needs, or the GSN, financial management and budgeting at school boards, and the process for school board infrastructure, new schools, renovations, and renewal. So let's get started with the GSN. In this part of the presentation, I will give you an overview of the Grants for Student Needs and will cover the structure and components of the GSN, the roles and responsibilities of the government and school boards for funding Ontario's education system, the key accountability mechanisms built into the GSN, and finally, I will highlight some of the changes that were announced in March 2014 as part of the 14-15 GSN. I will start by providing an overview of education funding in Ontario. The GSN, also known as the funding formula, is actually a set of detailed formulas that are set out in regulation under the Education Act each year. These regulations are approved by the Lieutenant Governor and Council each year. This level of detail is much more than for other broader public sector funding given Ontario's constitutional and charter obligations for education. The reason why the GSN is so important is that these formulas determine the vast majority of school board revenues, over 90%. So it's GSN funding that provides school boards with the bulk of the resources they need to deliver on our education vision and the 4 goals in that vision. Given how important the GSN is for school board budgeting, the ministry tries very hard every year to have the details of the GSN announced to school boards by the end of March so that you can develop your budget, which is due by the end of June. In fact, in recent years, the GSN has been announced at the end of March ahead of the provincial budget. This slide shows a graph representing the growth in GSN operating funding since 2002-03 compared to overall enrollment changes in the sector. For many years, the education sector has lived with 2 overarching trends: increased funding. In fact, total operating funding has increased by $8 billion or 56% since 2002-03, and declining enrollment. Average daily enrollment declined by about 7% from 2002-03 to 11-12. However, recently, these trends are starting to change. Enrollment is projected to rise province-wide and is being spurred on by the advent of full-day kindergarten. But this enrollment increase is not province-wide. Many areas of the province will continue to experience declines in enrollment. Funding growth has been curtailed. As with all areas of the public sector, program funding in the education sector will need to be managed very carefully if the province is to balance by 2017-18. Through the funding formula, the province allocates funding to each board based on a number of factors. These include things like the number of students attending your schools, the number of schools in your board, the distribution and physical condition, and the unique needs of the students in each board. School boards then allocate this funding based on local needs. The sources of funding remain the same as they have been for many years, namely education property tax. The rate is set by the Ministry of Finance and the property tax is collected by the municipality, who then transfers it to the school board, and then the province tops up the property tax collected by providing additional money through what is called a school board operating grant. This brings the total for each board up to the amount set out by the GSN. Currently, approximately 30% of the funding is from property tax and 70% from the school board operating grant. I now want to give you a short historical overview of the GSN. It is important to understand the historical underpinnings of the GSN to fully understand where we are at today. As many of you may recall, during the 1990s, education funding went through a major reform as a result of growing concerns about inequities in funding, programs, and services between school boards. Prior to 1997-98, school boards set local education property tax rates. This meant that school boards raised and spent different amounts on a per-pupil basis, depending on the wealth of the board's residential and commercial education tax base. As a result, rural, northern, and Catholic boards tended to raise less than large urban public boards. Large urban public boards also offered a wider range of community programs as they were able to afford these, given the relatively richer tax base that they enjoyed. A consensus emerged at the time that without equity in funding inputs, that is, the per-pupil funding, that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to have equity in student achievement across the province. As a result, in 1997, the government introduced a new education funding formula beginning in the 1998-99 school year. The current funding formula is based on several key principles. Equity of inputs, that is, equitable financial support as per Section 20 of the Scott Act of 1863, and not equity of outcomes. Fair and equitable allocation of inputs among boards and systems. Funding levels that should be adequate and sensitive to the unique circumstances of students and boards and assumed to yield an equitable range of student achievement outcomes. Accountability requirements that should be balanced against the needs for school board flexibility to meet local needs. Over the past more than a decade, the funding formula has been reviewed several times and in several ways. In 1998, the new education funding system was challenged in the courts. It was argued that the changes to education funding were in conflict with the Catholic school system's constitutional and charter guarantees. The court ultimately ruled that the new formula was constitutional and all challenges were dismissed. In 2002, a task force led by Mordecai Rosansky conducted a thorough public review of the funding formula. The task force concluded that while the funding formula was an equitable allocation vehicle, funding was inadequate to support improved student achievement. In 2003, a legislative review was conducted by the 4 trustee associations. They concluded that the funding formula was fair and non-discriminatory. In addition to these reviews, the ministry consults annually with the sector on the GSN to ensure that changes to the GSN better align with board cost structures, drive efficiencies, and support the government's student achievement agenda. This leads to regular refinements to the funding formula. This year, the ministry held education funding consultations across the province and all 72 school boards participated. In addition, the ministry met with all 4 trustee associations, as well as with teacher federations, education worker unions, principals and vice principals, parent organizations, and student groups. Let's now move to the structure of the GSN. The GSN is a very complex funding formula, but it is also a very transparent formula. The complexity comes from the legal requirement to maintain equitable rather than equal funding inputs for school boards in order to achieve equitable student outcomes across the province. The funding formula is therefore based on the cost structure of education, which by its nature is a complex endeavor. The transparency comes from the requirement to detail how each grant is calculated in regulation each and every year. A high-level description is also available on the ministry website. The GSN is composed of two major components. First of all, two foundation grants, the Pupil Foundation Grant and the School Foundation Grant. These grants cover the basic costs of a common educational experience for all students. They are also largely driven by enrollment multiplied by costs per student, as well as the school administration costs for each school. This is the equal portion of the GSN. Secondly, the GSN contains 13 special purpose grants. The 13 grants address the unique needs of students, schools, and school boards. Special purpose grants are grants that recognize the different levels of support required by boards, schools, and students related to location, student and school needs, and a board's demographic profile. This is the equitable component of the GSN. This slide shows a pie chart illustrating the current structure of the GSN for the 2014-15 school year. The two foundation grants, shaded in purple on the left side of the chart, total $11.96 billion, while the 13 special purpose grants shaded in green on the right total $10.54 billion. The principal strategic focus in recent years has been on reforming the funding formula so that funding is better matched to board cost structures, making the formula more responsive to local needs, support government education policies, and allowing school boards to manage expenditures within the ministry's approved GSN envelope. The special education grant is enveloped. This means that a board cannot move money out of that line to fund something else. As well, a school board cannot spend more than what is allocated for administration and governance. As I have mentioned, for the school board sector as a whole, GSN funding represents the overwhelming majority of revenues. Other sources of funding are highlighted in the bottom left box for comparison purposes. Based on 2013-14 revised estimate submissions from school boards, boards received $405 million in education program other and other government funding. Boards also received revenue from their own sources such as field trips and excursions and fundraising events. As you can tell from the previous slide in the 13 special purpose grants, the GSN is not a one-size-fits-all formula. If it were, all boards would receive the same funding on a per-pupil basis. As I mentioned earlier, GSN funding is based on need. That is, the funding that boards need to deliver programs and services to all students at a level that is comparable or equitable across the province. The way funding is allocated through the formulas are the vehicles that determine what boards need. Because need will vary from board to board, per-pupil funding varies between boards. In fact, in 2014-15, per-pupil levels are projected to vary across the province from $10,125 to $26,950. Whenever taxpayer dollars are involved, accountability is important and expected. In the case of the GSN, about $22 billion taxpayer dollars are allocated each and every year, so accountability is a key concept, and a very robust accountability framework has been developed between school boards in the province. I should acknowledge that accountability can mean different things to different people, and certainly school boards must be accountable to the people that elected them as well as the province that funds them. We continue to engage school board officials to ensure that we strike the right balance of accountability mechanisms and strive to maintain accountability for taxpayer dollars while allowing school boards the flexibility to make local decisions. In this next section, I will briefly review some of the changes in the GSN that were announced in March 2014. As I mentioned earlier, regular refinements are made annually to the funding formula. Several new elements for this year's GSN include full funding for FDK is now in the GSN like all other grades. This means that FDK is now an open entitlement program, and the province will provide funding for every child that is enrolled in your schools. As you know, collective agreements in this sector expired on August 31st, 2014, and given that no new replacement labor framework is in place at this time, the government continues to meet its ongoing labor commitments with the various employee groups, and these ongoing commitments are reflected in the GSN details. The government continues to encourage school boards to make more efficient use of school space. Through the 2014-15 GSN, changes were made to promote more efficient use of school space. The overall investment to support that shift totals $773 million to date, in comparison to a $42 million reduction in funding for underutilized space. This year, we held extensive consultations with stakeholders, including with Trustee Association representatives, to seek advice on how best to move forward on a number of initiatives and issues facing education in Ontario. We heard an appreciation for the process, a recognition of the difficult fiscal realities facing all areas of the Ontario public sector, including education, and a need to balance local knowledge and central direction. I should say that these conversations are not always easy. However, Ontario has a tradition of frank and open conversations about education funding that we see as a foundation stone of the system and the success of our children within it. The second part of this presentation focuses on providing you with an overview of your key responsibilities as trustees as it relates to budgeting and financial management. Let's start with budgeting and planning. The Education Act, Section 231, requires that school boards in Ontario have a balanced budget. This obviously means that your responsibility as a trustee is to ensure that the budget is indeed balanced and stays in balance throughout the year. The school board must adopt a balanced budget in June of every year, and you must ensure that your projected spending does not exceed your projected revenues. There is a provision in the Education Act that does allow a board to have an in-year deficit as long as it is less than 1% of your operating revenue and that it can be covered by your accumulated surplus. When your in-year deficit is in excess of 1%, you must seek approval of the Minister of Education, and you must have sufficient accumulated surplus to cover the deficit. The ministry approval process includes a thorough review of the details of the deficit and the board's overall financial position. As illustrated in this slide, in cases where boards are in an accumulated deficit position or analysis indicates that there is a high risk of a future deficit, there are provisions in the Education Act which allow for the ministry to act accordingly. This includes requesting a board to prepare a deficit management plan. If this is not successful in addressing the financial issues in question, the minister may initiate an investigation of the board's financial affairs. This is initiated in instances where a board not only has a deficit, but also if there are concerns with the board's ability to meet its financial obligations. If these concerns are supported with just cause, the minister has the authority to request the Lieutenant Governor and Council to vest control and charge over the administration of the affairs of the board to the ministry. Such a request would lead to the appointment of a supervisor to oversee the affairs of the board. This power is only used sparingly and only in the most extreme cases. The budget development process is a critical task that demonstrates a board's effectiveness and transparency. In order for the process to be successful, it is best practice in organizations that all parts of the organization be involved in its development, not just the finance staff. This means that the director, the superintendents, and other senior program staff should be involved. The budget process is a consultative process based on key principles including the educational needs of students, living within one's means, and reflecting the board's vision as well as supporting the goals of the board's multi-year strategic plan. The strategic plan is the umbrella under which all the board's activities must fit. The strategic planning process is how an organization defines its direction and allocates its resources to pursue that strategy. As part of that strategic planning process, boards should develop a multi-year budget forecast and capital plan to ensure that the strategy that the board is adopting in its strategic plan can actually be realized within the resources at the disposal of the board. A review of the board's spending, as well as continuously assessing capital priority needs and projected future enrollment, are critical in the process of achieving the board's overall strategic plan. If this sounds like an iterative process, it is. This slide shows a graphic depicting the board budget cycle. A board budget cycle involves two main phases that occur during the year. The first phase, illustrated in the top arrow of the graphic, includes assessing the activities and outcomes of the previous year and/or the most recent information available in order to plan for the upcoming year. The second phase, illustrated in the bottom arrow, includes stakeholder consultations on your budget, followed by the approval of the budget and regular monitoring of the budget to ensure that they stay in a balanced position. Let's now turn to financial management. Trustees play a critical role in financial management. You have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that your organization meets all its legal obligations, including the financial obligations. As a board, you are required to review and approve financial management policies such as expense policies and procurement policies. You also have the responsibility to receive and seek any clarification about the audited financial statements prepared and presented by the treasurer of the board through the audit committee. Additional information on audit and audit committees will be presented later in this presentation. A transparent and thorough budget planning process analyzes all major revenues and expenditures that are estimated for the upcoming year, looks at spending patterns of your board compared to the grants that your board receives. Where there are differences that reflect local needs, you should be aware of the reasons for these differences. After all, the GSN is a province-wide funding formula that provides school boards with some flexibility to allocate resources. Your board should also develop risk and mitigation strategies to deal with changes in circumstances such as risks on enrollment projections and impact on staffing. Finally, you should always view your decisions from a multi-year perspective. Are the decisions you are taking today to start a new program fiscally sustainable in the future? School boards are required to submit financial reports to the ministry 3 times per financial cycle. Estimates on June 30th, revised estimates on December 15th, and audited financial statements on November 15th. The financial data submitted through the ministry's reporting system, EFAS, calculates the board's funding based on enrollment and other information provided. All data collected is used for reviewing and monitoring compliance and financial risks and to support policy decisions. Enrollment audits are conducted annually to ensure compliance with enrollment legislation and policy. All 72 school boards are audited every 5 years. Financial reporting and monitoring is supported in several areas. The Director of Education signs off and certifies that the board's financial statements and other reports are prepared in accordance with the Education Act and the financial regulations. The board's external auditors, which are appointed by the board, reports on the financial statements to ensure proper controls are in place and that the statements are prepared in accordance with accounting standards. Ministry staff conducts standard review procedures to verify a board's financial status, the enveloping provisions, and the grant entitlements. The Auditor General of Ontario also has the authority to conduct financial audits of a school board and has exercised this authority in the past. The ministry monitors the financial health of school boards. This includes assessing a board's potential risk of incurring deficits. In instances where a board is considered to be high risk, they may be asked to develop deficit management plans or multi-year recovery plans. This will assist the board in working towards ensuring that they regain financial stability. Good internal controls and identifying risks early are key to avoiding negative consequences. Interim financial reporting assists with monitoring a board's financial progress. Revenue and expenditure variances can be identified, allowing the board to make decisions to address any concerns. This next section will briefly touch upon audit committees and internal audit, what they are and why they're important. As you saw earlier, GSN funding for 2014-15 is projected to exceed $22.5 billion. It is critical that sufficient oversight is in place for these taxpayer dollars. Audit committees and internal audit were identified as ways to improve governance in this sector, as when well run, these functions contribute to good governance, transparency, and accountability, which are key to increasing or regaining public confidence. Prior to the implementation of these province-wide initiatives in 2010 and 2011, the existence and use of these functions were inconsistent across school boards. Internal audit is a function which helps you, as trustees, determine whether risks to the achievement of your school board's objectives are appropriately identified and managed. Among other duties, the audit committee oversees the internal audit function. As publicly funded organizations, school boards face scrutiny on a number of fronts: FOI requests, the Auditor General, the Ministry, parent and community stakeholder groups, to name a few. Where issues are uncovered from this scrutiny, there is a good chance it will end up on the front page of the newspaper or the lead item on the 6 o'clock news. However, by having this framework in place, issues may be identified and addressed before they hit the media or result in another negative outcome such as financial loss or impact on student performance. Less time spent dealing with these issues means more time to devote to the students of your school board. So what is an audit committee? An audit committee is a standing committee of the board. The role of the audit committee is to oversee and assess the performance of the school board's management and make recommendations to the board. To give you some background on audit committees, in the education sector, Bill 177 on school board governance received royal assent in December 2009. This bill amended the Education Act to require the creation of an audit committee in each district school board and enable the creation of an audit committee regulation. Ontario Regulation 36110 was enacted into law in September 2010, requiring committees to be in place by the end of January 2011. The regulation specifies the terms of reference for school board audit committees, including composition of audit committees, which require external members with financial expertise. It also specifies the size of your audit committee, which is based on the size of your board. The regulation also requires a minimum of 3 meetings a year. Duties of the audit committee make up a large part of the regulation and fall into 6 main areas: the financial reporting process, internal controls, the board's internal and external auditor, risk management, and compliance matters. Powers of the audit committee are also set out as follows. With prior approval of the board, the power to retain counsel, accountants, or other professionals to advise or assist the committee, the power to meet with or require attendance of various parties at audit committee meetings, and require these parties to provide any information and explanation that may be requested. This also includes the power for the audit committee to hold a private session with the internal auditor, external auditor, or any staff member as required. The power to require the internal or external auditor to provide reports to the committee. The power to have access to all records of the board that were examined by the internal or external auditor. Now we'll move on to internal audit, what they do, and the regional model that is in place. Through the annual update of the risk assessment, development of the audit plan, execution of planned audits, and reporting on the results of the audit, your internal audit function provides management and the audit committee with objective assessments of your school board's risk management, control, and governance processes. Internal audit evaluates and provides reasonable, not absolute assurance these processes are functioning as intended. Internal audit engagements follow an internationally recognized set of standards and practices. Funding through the GSN supports a regional internal audit model, whereby Ontario's 72 school boards are split into 8 regions, 7 based on geography and 1 to cover all French language boards. Each region has a team of auditors supporting between 6 and 12 boards, with a host board in the region receiving the funding for the team. This regional model was chosen so that through collaboration amongst boards, resources can be used more efficiently. A set of best practices can be developed through exposure to the same processes at multiple boards. Resources can be distributed equitably, taking into consideration board size, language, and location. And now on to the last part of this session, education capital. The ministry's roles and responsibilities for pupil accommodation includes developing and implementing capital funding programs and policies for boards to meet their pupil accommodation responsibilities. The ministry is also responsible for developing fair and equitable capital policies, programs, and guidelines, and ensuring that accountability requirements are met. The trustee role and responsibility for pupil accommodation includes making decisions related to pupil accommodation and safety, ensuring that students have a good learning environment, living within the budget, determining policies and priorities when undertaking capital work, for example, when to renovate, repair, or build a new facility, and determining the status of schools. Should it stay open, should it close, or should the property be sold? Trustees are also responsible for ensuring that board staff have developed a capital plan and that capital projects adhere to ministry objectives and funding benchmarks. The Ministry provides funding for various capital purposes, and at present we have the following capital programs that school boards can access for funding support. The Capital Priorities Grant, which provides funding for new schools, additions, and major renovations. The School Consolidation Capital Grant, which provides funding for the consolidation of schools and the right sizing of a board's capital footprint. And the School Condition Improvement Funding, which provides funding to address renewal needs of schools. In the following slides, I will go into more detail about each of these capital programs. The Capital Priorities Grant is an annual program that funds new schools, additions, and major renovations to address enrollment growth pressures, replace schools in poor condition, and support school consolidations. The Ministry's role is to allocate the funding by reviewing each business case submitted by the board and to ensure the funding request aligns with the program objectives. Given that there are always more requests for funding than there is money, the Ministry's role includes recommending the projects that will be funded. The Ministry is also responsible for establishing space standards and funding benchmarks that all projects must adhere to. Trustees are responsible for ranking and prioritizing capital business cases that the board submits to the Ministry for funding consideration. Trustees should be aware of any alternative options or solutions for a project that board staff have explored. Once a project receives a capital approval from the Ministry, trustees must ensure that project costs stay within the Ministry's funding benchmarks and the approved funding allocation. The School Consolidation Capital Grant was announced in the 2014-15 GSN release as part of the School Board Efficiencies and Modernization Initiative. Over 4 years, the Ministry is providing $750 million to help school boards adjust their capital footprint by right-sizing their facilities and getting rid of excess school space. The Ministry and trustee roles and responsibilities are similar to what I just went through for the Capital Priorities Grant Program. The Ministry oversees a school condition assessment program which reviews the condition of each school in the province over a 5-year period. As a result of this assessment, we know that there are many schools across the province that have a significant backlog of renewal needs and require additional investments in school renewal to prevent further deterioration. The Ministry is responsible for providing renewal funding to the school boards. To that end, the Ministry has made a significant new 3-year investment of $1.25 billion in school condition improvement funding in 2014-15, tripling the previous annual funding amount. The assessment program highlights the need for the continued support of renewal funding for school boards. Trustees are responsible to ensure the prudent use of renewal dollars to address facility condition and to provide safe facilities for students. Trustees should ensure board staff have developed a long-term strategy for dealing with ongoing renewal needs at schools. Based on data provided by school boards, we know that almost 600 schools across Ontario are less than half full. Almost $300 million of total school operations and school renewal funding is, as a result, being spent on this empty space. To address school utilization, the Ministry has created programs and incentives for boards to look at a more effective way of utilizing available space. Trustees need to be prepared to make the difficult decisions required to address the fiscal pressures associated with having empty space. On the following slide, I will outline the steps that boards follow for their planning around excess space. This chart outlines the steps that can be used by boards to address their excess space. The first step is to find an effective use for that excess space. This may include seeking partnerships, including a joint school with a coterminous board, developing a school community hub, adjusting the school attendance boundary, restructuring grade configurations, or program offerings at the school. Any of these options could fill unused space at the school. If that is not successful, the second step is for the board to undertake an accommodation review. The Ministry has established the Pupil Accommodation Review Guideline for boards to undertake accommodation reviews in a consistent manner. Trustees are responsible for following the guidelines and forming the Accommodation Review Committee to undertake the review. The third step is to dispose of surplus property. Ontario Regulation 44498 sets out steps the board must undertake when selling or leasing school space. Trustees are responsible for declaring a closed school surplus and following the steps set out in the regulation. The Ministry has developed the Pupil Accommodation Review Guideline that requires school boards to undertake a meaningful community consultation prior to closing schools, as well as ensures consistency across the province. The Ministry is currently consulting with stakeholders, including trustee associations, on possible revisions to the guideline, and we intend to release the revised guidelines in the new year. The feedback we have gotten from trustee associations and school boards on the revised guideline has been positive. We hope that the revised guideline will make the school closure and consolidation process more flexible for school boards while ensuring the affected communities have meaningful input into the process. Trustees are responsible for adhering to the Pupil Accommodation Review Guideline. The final decisions about school closures are made by school board trustees. Trustees have to approve their board's Pupil Accommodation Review policy, which must comply with the Ministry's Pupil Accommodation Review Guideline. This slide lists our website that contains a wealth of information that you can access. I would encourage all of you to do so. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. We hope that you have found it informative, and should you have any feedback, please do not hesitate to contact us. Should you have any questions about education funding in Ontario, please do not hesitate to contact us at fpbd-dpfo@ontario.ca.